All right, it's really a pleasure to give a very warm welcome to our panelists and everybody who's joined via the live stream on Facebook. My name's John Chalcraft. I'm a professor of Middle East history and politics in the Department of Government at LSE, and it's an honor to chair this event, which is a book launch of Sara Salem's book, Anticolonial Afterlives in Egypt, the Politics of Hegemony. And it's a great pleasure to gather together a very distinguished panel to help discuss and launch and engage with you on this book. The running order for how we're going to do this is Sara Salem is going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes right at the beginning, and then we'll have contributions from the rest of the panelists, 5 to 10 minutes each. Then we'll give Sara the right to reply after that, and then we'll open things out to questions that you'll be able to post if you're watching this live on Facebook. And the way this will work is that if you have questions for our panel, please post them as a comment on this Facebook live stream, or tweet them to at LSE Sociology, and then we'll get them, and we really look forward to both the panelists and the discussion. But thanks to the Department of Sociology, and especially to all the panelists and everybody who's shown up on Facebook. So just to say who we have, first of all, the author of the book, Sara Salem. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at LSE. Her main research interests include political sociology, postcolonial studies, Marxist theory, feminist theory, and global histories of empire and imperialism. And of course, it's her book, Anticolonial Afterlives in Egypt, Politics of Hegemony, very recently out, that we're here to discuss. After Sara, we're going to hear from Laleh Khalili. She's a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London and is the author of a string of books. She has Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, The Politics of National Commemoration, Cambridge University Press, 2007. She has Time in the Shadows, Confinement in Counterinsurgencies, book from Stanford in 2013, and most recently, her Verso 2020 book, Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula. Usually, I'm sure there's a sort of warm round of applause, but we'll just sort of take that as read, given that we're on Zoom and there's a sort of a Facebook live stream going on. The second person to speak will be Adam Elliott-Cooper. He's a research associate at the University of Greenwich, and his scholarly interests include postcolonialism, urban theory, and social movements. His current research focuses on anti-racism and British policing, both on the British mainland and in Britain's colonies. And his book, which is forthcoming with Manchester University Press, is entitled Black Resistance to British Policing. Third up, and we hope, although let me just check, I'm not sure she's joined yet, but we're hoping she still will be Dina Makram-Ebeid. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Egyptology, and Anthropology at the American University of Cairo, and her research interests revolve around the anthropology of labor and 2011 and questions of affective labor and emotion work in the uprisings and beyond. And finally, to speak, we have Adam Hanieh, who's a reader in development studies at SOAS, University of London, and he's author of a whole string of books, but his most recent one is Money, Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, Cambridge University Press, 2018. And that book actually won a 2019 British International Studies Association book prize. So really, it's a huge pleasure to welcome the panel and the author of Anticolonial Afterlives. And let me then turn things over to Sara Salem, who's going to speak for 5 to 10 minutes and take us into and introduce us to the wonderful and accomplished book that she's written.
Thank you, John. And thank you everyone who's joining us today. And I really wanted to say a special thank you to Adam, both Adams, to Laleh and to Dina. Hopefully she'll be able to join us, for taking the time to read the book and engage with it. And of course, thank you, John, for sharing. All of your work has been really inspiring, so it's such a pleasure to talk about the book with you today. I also wanted to thank Maddie Giles, our events coordinator, who's been really helpful in setting up the event. And of course, the nice thing about having it online is that so many people, different parts of the world, can log in, including my parents from Cairo, so that's both nice and really nerve-wracking. But I just want to use this 10 minutes to kind of give a brief overview of what the book is about, especially considering probably most people haven't read it yet. The book is split into two connected parts. The first explores the moment of decolonization in Egypt through its kind of the post-colonial state project that emerged. And the second explores the decades that come afterwards, so thinking through the afterlives of this project that we see in the 50s and 60s. And so the first part of the book tries to think through Egypt's anti-colonial moment. And I think that although the politics of decolonization are really central to the way the world works and kind of the world we live in today, there's still so much to think about in relation to kind of the complexities of that moment, as well as the contradictions of the projects that were formalized at that time. Given that it's such a powerful but also complicated moment in history, I was really drawn to a form of writing that begins from an acknowledgement of these contradictions and that takes these contradictions as a starting point. So rather than trying to resolve them or to kind of avoid them, to actually think of how the politics, the global and national politics of that moment produce these very contradictory political projects, but also how those projects continue to live with us in the present. I think that the figures, symbols, and ideas of decolonization crop up quite often in contemporary Egypt. And there are also these legacies, such as the legacy of military power, that are often traced back to the founding of the post-colonial state. So partly the book emerged as an attempt to think through both the anti-colonial struggle and the post-colonial state through this idea of thinking of it as a political project, which I call nazarism. The second part of the book talks a little bit about the afterlives of those decades. And I think of this period kind of through this idea of projects of the free market. So there are two connected projects that emerge at this moment, one in the late 60s and one in the 2000s. And I think these two projects, although different, are connected by this turn towards the free market and a turn away from kind of the politics that had animated decolonization, not just in Egypt, but across the global South. So these two projects, I think I try to understand as actually haunted by the one that came before it. I think what's quite interesting is that the turn to the free market is often presented or was represented by the ruling classes that kind of watched over it as being the polar opposite of nazarism. But what's interesting is that in many ways, I think they were a response to nazarism and were also, in a sense, working within certain ideas of the political and the economic that were defined by the Nazarist state in the 50s and 60s. So this connection between past and present was one that I was really interested in unpacking and thinking of how those decades speak to the 2011 revolution, which to me at that moment seemed to be analyzed much more as a living event or as an event that can be understood through the 1990s and 2000s, but not always further back than that. So theoretically, I found Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony and Frantz Fanon's concept of the dependent bourgeoisie really invigorating to think with. I found them really interesting in terms of analyzing these successive political projects, what animated them, the powerful ways they attempted to organize society, but also the really different types of resistance that they encountered. So the book brings these two concepts and these two theorists into conversation. And I think there has been this tendency to see Marxism and post-colonial or anti-colonial theory in tension, but I think of course, there's a very long history from, Arab Marxism to the Black radical tradition that actually thinks of these concepts together. So I use the lens of traveling theory from Edward Said to ask, well, what happens to this idea of hegemony when it travels? So Gramsci's positionality in Southern Italy obviously is really interesting to think about and how he understands dependency. But thinking with Fanon's idea of Marxism as it stretches, or the stretching of Marxism, a lot of the book also tries to pay attention to what happens to hegemony itself in the context of a post-colony. So just a really quick note on hegemony, because I think it's a very widely debated concept, as all Marxist concepts are. In this book, I actually follow John Chalcraft's kind of framing of hegemony as a particular structure of power. I thought that was really evocative in relation to the nazarist period. And it's that structure of power that I was really interested in exploring. And in particular, I think this idea really touches on the core of hegemony, which is this balance almost between consent and coercion, so that in any hegemonic project, coercion and consent exist in a really close dialectical relationship. And again, to me, that spoke to Nasserism quite evocatively, and in that coercion was not necessarily quantitatively lower than before or after, but there's something to be said about what seemed to me the really strong levels of consent that we see at that moment. And that consent, I think, comes about through a lot of different avenues, which I'm happy to talk about later, but it is, I think, quite distinctive of that particular period. So I try to show that in the 2 decades following Egyptian independence from Britain in 52, we see the rise and fall of this period of hegemony. I think that Nasserism as a hegemonic project, again, produces a form of hegemony that is closely tied to both colonialism and anti-colonialism. I think it was made possible through the anti-colonial moment itself, through the energies of anti-colonial movements that preceded the state, but also through the shifting kind of global politics that we see across the world in the 50s and 60s. So again, to think of it as a traveling concept, I think hegemony is very much connected actually to the colonial and anti-colonial in this context of the 1950s Egypt. Interestingly, I think that this idea of Nasserism as hegemony comes somewhat into tension with Fanon's prediction or warning that post-colonial ruling classes could not become hegemonic, right? Because they were structured to be dependent. And this kind of comes back to this idea of the contradictions of this project. I think in some ways, Fanon's reading is an accurate reading of the Nasserist project, especially in relation to the adoption of state-led capitalism, these ideas of modernity and development and civilization, and all of the gendered, race, and class pillars of these types of projects. And also the ways in which Nasserism really embodied this idea of mastery. But I think in other ways, Nasserism does seem to interrupt this prediction, right? It did attempt to break with this infrastructure of extractivism that comes with colonial capitalism. And I think we see this in particular through the ways in which industry as the basis of production becomes so central at this moment. We do actually see Fanon's dependent class emerge in Egypt, only, I argue, a bit later than predicted. I think in the late 70s, during this shift from Nasserism to the first project of the free market, we see the rise of a new group of businessmen. And in Egyptian films and novels, they're often, caricatured in really specific ways, really rich, very decadent, very westernized, in ways that actually match the way Fanon writes about this class quite clearly. I think in the second part of the book, I argue that this ruling class that we see at this moment, as well as the one that emerges a bit later in the early 2000s, were unable to create the type of structure of power or hegemonic project that we see under Nasserism. And this has a whole range of consequences, and we can even understand 2011, I think, as as partly a consequence of this. Because by 2011, many of the pillars of the post-colonial state project, including an industry-driven economy, a large public sector, elements of social welfare, and so on, have been completely reversed. Yet with this rapid shift to the free market, and this shift kind of became much faster in the early 2000s, we don't see the type of consent that I think would have worked to create a structure of power like the one we see under Nasserism, leaving us with a ruling class that was governing over a very weak political system, and that was was characterized by the everyday police brutality and other forms of consent that had become even more visible because of the drop in consent. So in the book, I speak of this period, sort of the late 60s to 2011, as the afterlife of hegemony, because I see it as made up of both the absence of hegemonic projects, but also it's very interestingly marked as also kind of by the slow coming apart of Nazirism as a hegemonic project as well. And so it's quite interesting to think of how Nazirism had these multiple endpoints. 67 is one, I think, with the defeat to Israel, but also over time, the slow reversal of what we come to understand as the Nazarist political project, I think kind of it takes much longer than we might have thought or we might have expected. The final part of the book reflects on the contradictions of Egypt's anti-colonial moment, but also how these contradictions set the ground for forms of political and economic transformation that come afterwards. And here I think quite a bit with the idea of haunting, which I take from Avery Gordon's work in particular. I think in some ways this is a very structured book that thinks about history and political economy in quite fixed ways. And what captured my imagination with haunting, which happened towards the end of the project, was that it seemed to make sense of political shifts and economic shifts and how they come into the present, even when we can't really capture what those shifts are or how they took place. It also was interesting to me as a framework for thinking about Nazirism and Nasser himself and the way as a figure and as a project they haunt the present or show up in the present in kind of really interesting ways. I think that there's something about the promise of anti-colonialism that is really haunting, even as we know that the post-colonial state projects that emerged at this moment didn't deliver on many of these promises. But there's also something about how anti-colonialism came apart that I think is quite haunting as well. So I want to end with a quote from Sara Salem on the ambivalent legacies of the past and how ghosts seep into the present. So she writes, quote, "Legacies are ambivalent things. The hundreds of thousands of young men and women who took the streets in 2011 were also haunted by ghosts of the past. Their language, their songs and symbols, their remembering of bygone battles all drew on a history rich with the struggle for freedom." Thank you.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. And if we don't want to read the book already, I'm sure we're looking forward to hear what Professor Laleh Khalili has to say. And you have 5 to 10 minutes, Laleh, to I don't know whether you're going to, lambast the book or praise it to the skies, but we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Sarah, for asking me to participate in this panel with so many amazing people. I'm incredibly grateful. I'm also grateful to your department for organizing things in such an efficient way. And thank you very much, John, for your introduction. I'm really glad you ended with a quotation from Sara Salem, which I'm not sure you know, but when I was taking Fusha at Columbia University, she was my Fusha instructor. So there's a nice circularity to this. And I'm also really glad that you actually ended with the question of the ambivalence, because some of what I want to talk about is about the earlier part of the book and about the nazarist project itself, because what I'm really interested in is that element of at Columbia University, she was which I think is quite interesting and troubling. And I want to sort of ask you to explain it a little bit more, perhaps, if you could. While I was reading your book in preparation for this talk, I was also reading a bunch of other things in preparation for class, and because one reads stuff. And it was interesting because within a day or two of one another, I finished reading Adam Getterchu's, a little bit late because it's come out about a year ago, book World Making After Empire. And then immediately thereafter, I read an interview with Nandita Sharma about her book, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, which I haven't had a chance to read, but I read this long interview with her. And what was really striking was that, in fact, it seemed that these two books speak to the same period that you're writing about, or at least in the earlier part of your book you're writing about, and to many of the same concerns. So what was striking to me was that Adam Getachew book writes about self-determination, which is meant as an ideal, and it is about the struggles over the possibility of a rule that steps beyond nationalism and beyond the sort of the colonial ideas about state making. And although it ends with a discussion of the failure of self-determination in the process, I think one of the things that's extremely appealing about her book is the fact that it has a sense of the promise and the possibilities of that moment. What was very striking, finishing that book and then reading Nandita Sharma's interview, was the extent to which in the interview, she actually challenges that idea of the promise. She will not give any quarter to the promise of the moment of decolonization. She sees in nationalism and anti-colonial nationalism no opening other than chauvinism, and finds in the nationalism of the post-colonial moment a reaffirmation of capitalism and the production of the migrant as a category of people that have to be contained, punished, exploited, and sometimes even exterminated. So in a way, it's because she does not recognize that that promise in the way that Getachew does, perhaps, although she also talks about how that promise has come to fail, they fall somewhere on a spectrum where one is actually more optimistic and the other not so optimistic, perhaps more pessimistic or realistic about the post-colonial possibilities. Of course, these two books are very recent ones, but as far back as almost a decade ago, David Scott has, of course, also written about this moment as a kind of a tragic moment. And so what is interesting is that this retrospective evaluation tends to do one of these things, tends to actually look at this promise or tends to refute it. Now, what is interesting about your book, and I found really fascinating, is that your book is neither a celebration of the post-colonial moment in Egypt, nor a complete disavowal of it. Instead, what you do is explain the location of the Nazarist project at home and abroad, its import and its after echoes and failures. Some of what makes your book, Sara, so interesting is the way you explain the construction of Nazarist hegemony in the 1950s. Your Colonial Afterlives is really careful to explain the emergence of state-owned capitalist ventures, of the rise of a new bourgeoisie, but also of a new military class of technocrats. Some of the most powerful parts of the book are where you discuss how Nasser could be such a powerful and beloved force, even as modernist mega projects destroyed swathes of villages. And in fact, it seems like in her book, Nandita Sharma also talks about Nkrumah's mega dam projects, which resulted in mass displacement of citizens. So there's a kind of a continuity in these mega modernist projects. And also, of course, you focus on how his concentration, Nasser's concentration of power, was consolidated on the back of political prisoners, and some of his lofty international rhetoric were not matched in a genuine way in action. Of course, a lot of Palestinians would probably attest to that. So there's this very interesting way in which you evaluate the Nazarist period itself. Now, the questions I want to ask you, and I have 3 of them, so you choose which one you want to ask, which one you want to answer, and I can write them in the chat for you, and I'll copy them into chat for you so that you can deal with them later, is about this period of decolonization. I am really curious about the ambivalences of it, and I would like for you to talk a little bit about it, although you do so beautifully both in the latter part of the book and of course in her, if I can be so cheeky as to mention this, in a possible future book, which you're hoping to write about this haunting of Nasserism in Egyptian politics. What you sketch in your book feels to me utterly persuasive about the construction of this hegemony through, for example, Saut al-Arab, through the structure of the military, the expansion of higher education, and of course, land reforms. But having said that, and I'm being a little bit unfair here because these are subjects you touch on in the book, and I know you discuss further in other and future projects, but let me ask them anyway. First, to what extent was the Nazarist hegemonic project at home bolstered by his stature abroad? So in other words, to what extent was his repressive policies at home legitimated, even accepted by Egyptians, because he was seen as an hero outsider? As a hero outside of Egypt. And why did this matter? Why did Nasser's stature outside of Egypt such a significant factor in his stature domestically? Which brings me to the second question. to what extent did the affective life world Nasser generated around him, what can be called charisma, or maybe even sex appeal, which he did have in bushels, and you can see that in the lectures that he gives and in the speeches that he gives, his use of, for example, ambivalent and the vernacular when he's speaking, his joke telling, his utter charm when he speaks. So to what extent does this affective life world that Nasser generated around him was part of this process of hegemony making? And also how much of this was about his particular notion of masculinity? Now, the word that is often used when Nasser's talked about is rajula, a kind of manliness that went alongside with his height. He was quite a tall man, his care, his ease in giving speeches, his jokiness. So what is the role of affective and of masculinity in creating the conditions of hegemony? And if these matter at all, what do they say about the making of hegemony, the extraction of consent alongside coercion? And finally, a third question, which I have been thinking about, because throughout my academic life, I've argued that nationalism, while it's outside of power, it has quite a lot of promise. But the moment that a nationalist project comes to power, it immediately becomes an instrument of force, coercion, state violence, etc., etc. So reading that interview with Nandita Sharma really, again, brought up this question for me, which is nationalism always fated to collapse into chauvinism? For example, the geopolitical import of challenging US allies for Nasser sometimes gave way to a language that belittled marginal communities or even enemies in civilizational, communal, national terms rather than political ones. So is it possible to have a non-chauvinist nationalism as a hegemonic project? And this is a very unfair question because this is one of my problems. I'm not sure that you're interested in that, but I wanted to ask these. And in the end, I wanted to say thank you so much for allowing me to think through with your book, because it did in many ways bring up questions, and it made me want to talk to you and to sort of discuss elements of the book with you. And I have lots of other questions, but I'm going to leave it with these three, and I'll type them into the chat for you if you want to look at them later. Thank you very much, Sara.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that important intervention. And Sarah will come back a bit later, but in the meantime, the next up, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the floor, Adam Elliott-Cooper.
Hi, everyone. Just want to begin again by saying thank you so much, Sara, for inviting me to engage with this text. It's a really, really fascinating book. I've been following Sara's work for a long time, of course, and was able to work with her and think through these questions of, I guess, as Sara mentioned before, the relationship between post and anti-colonial theory and Marxist theory, and how ideas of racial capitalism and other forms of, I guess, third world or global south idea engagement with Marxism is a really fundamentally important, I think, urgent project for academics and researchers. And I think there's maybe two, broadly speaking, things that I found particularly interesting or imaginative and kind of sparks a few ideas, very broadly speaking, in the book. I think the first is the way in which it looks at so much detail at how hegemony is produced and reproduced, and how a struggle for hegemonic power is engaged with. So even though it's a a book which takes place over a very broad period of time, it's still a very, very detailed book. It's meticulously analysed in almost the most kind of granular of detail. When we look at the different kind of stakeholders, the different types of groups, even the different individuals that are engaging with the Nazarist project and are implicated by the movement which took place in the 1950s and 60s in Egypt. And I think there are many things that I think can be not necessarily applied to other post-colonial contexts and even modern contexts, but there are certainly lessons to be learned, I think, and helping us to understand power struggles for leftist leaders, both in newly independent nations in the global south, but also, I think, for progressive and leftist movements in the contemporary moment as well. So Sara talks about the ways in which the Nazarist projects really had to gain a monopoly over or gain ownership over this nation building moment of Egyptian independence and engage in I guess what some scholars call a secondary decolonization, right? So not just attaining that formal independence, but really showing how formal independence can be changed and transformed into something which could be regarded as a real form of sovereignty, a real form of independence, and a real form of prosperity and essentially development. And we see this, of course, in other parts of the global south. I think one of the examples that really sprung to mind when I was reading it is the way in which the ANC in South Africa has been very, very effective in utilizing both coercion and co-optation, and utilizing its monopoly over this nation building projects, this independence moment for Black South Africa, and the problems that it's faced over the years in maintaining that hegemonic power while still being situated, of course, in a very different kind of hegemonic order, which has led to, of course, neoliberalization and all of the kinds of promises which made the ANC a hegemonic power being left to the wayside, and them really struggling with the contradictions of surviving and existing in a neoliberal world. But I think there's another kind of hegemonic project, which I think has been touched upon a little bit already, which I want to kind of probe a little bit more. And because of a lot of the book focuses on the hegemonic project which Nasser is engaged in on the domestic sphere. But of course, there is this other hegemony which the Nasserist project is struggling against, right? The global hegemonic order, which sees Europe and North America and other white settler colonies in dominant positions, and of course the darker nations of the global south remaining subservient. And again, I was, like Laleh, reflecting a lot on Adom Getachews' book, World Making After Empire, and the manner in which different global south projects attempted to reorder the global order, the global hegemonic order, knowing and understanding that simply having independence on its own, in and of itself, would not bring about sovereignty, would not bring about economic independence, and of course would not enable them to defend themselves from militaristic forms of neo-imperialist intervention. And so when I was reading the book and thinking through Adom's, I guess, criticisms of some of the regional projects that were developed in Africa and parts of the Caribbean, particularly the West Indian Federation, and attempts to create I guess, a federation of African nations in the 1950s and 60s, which in some ways are modeled on the United States, but also on other areas of the world as well, where federations of nations were able to engage in forms of economic power blocks and economic regional blocks as well. But also the ways in which certain countries within those blocks or within those attempts to develop these agreements ended up breaking free. And I feel like one of the reasons for that was because of these kind of regional powers. Right? So, for instance, in Jamaica, with the West Indian Federation, Jamaica is a far larger economy than a lot of the other economies in the Caribbean, and it felt like it wasn't getting enough from this regional hegemonic this regional project to try to resist and restructure the global order of nations in the world. And so you see the West Indian Federation projects break down in that regard. And similarly on the African continent, you have regional powers like Nigeria and others, which don't have that, which again see for themselves a possibility of independent sovereignty, which doesn't rely on them having to secede power and sovereignty to regional South-South or other regional projects in order to have that kind of sovereignty and resist the global order. And I wonder whether, to an extent, Nasser's projects in Egypt is also very kind of symptomatic of this problem, because on the one hand, there were, of course, a lot of problems with the Pan-African projects at the time. They refused to have anything remotely approaching a critical stance on the question of Palestine. There are lots of certainly problems in that regard. Whilst at the same time, of course, like Nigeria, Egypt is also a regional power, particularly with power over the Suez Canal and its large population. There was, I think, a relationship there to the rest of the African continent, which meant that it could see itself as being a leader of the continent, and therefore potentially not necessarily needing to devolve any of its power or sovereignty or economic autonomy to regional blocs, which may be able to, through a collective approach to world making, reconfigure the global order that so many of these newly independent states were struggling against. And so I feel like the nazarist projects and the way the book brings together the questions of both hegemony and Fanon is a really fantastic way of understanding and kind of getting to grips of not only the multiple and complex struggles which these newly independent leftist leaders were engaging with in the domestic sphere to try to maintain their power, but also the ways in which this was also very much an international project as well. And there were so similar kinds of contradictions being faced on the international sphere, where a different kind of hegemonic struggle was being engaged in, not one as a battle for hegemony, but a battle against an existing hegemonic order. And I think it's the complexity of the multiple contradictions in both the domestic and the international that the case of the Nazarist project provides such a rich and fascinating case study for extrapolating and better understanding the period in which the Nazarist projects existed. So I don't have any questions for you, but I hope that some of the kind of reflections I have had have been useful and interesting, and I look forward to having further discussion. Thanks.
Lovely, thank you very much. Adam Elliott-Cooper, for those reflections, that important intervention. So it's a pleasure now to bring Dina Makram-Ebeid into the discussion, and you have 10 minutes, Dina.
Thank you, John, and thanks, Sara, for the invitation, for being here. I want to say that I want to tell her first, it's mabruk, and it's one thing seeing friends being engaged in their creative labor and that creative labor coming into fruition, but it's another thing when the final product is actually fascinating. And I reread the book with a lot of joy. I'm very thankful that Sara let me in on the process of it, but the end product was really beautiful, and I read it with a lot of joy. And found myself again asking myself big questions that she's engaged us with. And I want to talk about a few things that I think what she's doing is in the book is fascinating, and then maybe ask you a question about or two, or reflect together on them. But I want to also think about it not just in terms of the academic impact of it, but also how to engage with that type of work effectively or emotively. And I was thinking that, you know, sitting in my flat in Cairo, reading the Anticolonial Afterlives in Egypt, sitting basically in the post moment, or the empty time, or hyper empty time, to quote the empty time that you talk about, which delineates that period between 1967 and 2011, when Sara talks about the end of the project, when there was no project to defend. And I found it interesting that sitting here, you know, CC's Egypt, thinking, being very moved by the story that Sara is weaving together. And I think it's a story that moves us away from what Jose Esteban Munoz would have called the prison house of the here and now, and a call really to thinking of the then and there and the possibilities they bring. So what Sara does really beautifully, I think, in the book is weave a story over a longue durée, one that helps us see two separate sets of revolutions as increasingly interconnected, and both materially and through the class projects that they're trying to push forth, and how these class projects are almost in clear contradiction with one another, but also, and I think quite importantly, and again quite movingly for me, is thinking through the repeated specters and ghosts that they bring about. The ghost that she is quoting Avery Gordon, you know, saying that they keep appearing because there are unresolved tensions. And I feel that the whole book is really trying to think about these unresolved tensions that keep, you know, popping up here and there, and pop up again later in 2011 and onwards. And I think again, I want to reflect not just on it academic, but what it means to read that book in that context, you know, as a living form of, as a living text, so to speak, or a living archive. And I think Sara is a great storyteller because she's also helping us to tell a story about ourselves, you know, and I think these are the stories we make about the world that are able to help us create these worlds and to situate ourselves in them. So I think there is a story here of the anti-colonial afterlives and the hegemonic project of Nasser that, you know, takes us to this question of why revolutions. I mean, the question that probably most of the people here, and without like acting like the local informant or, you know, or that role, but I think that that kind of the question that preoccupies people of like, why do these revolutions persistently fail? And also, what do we make of these persistent post-colonial imaginaries? And I think these become very central in the book, but through a story really, and a story that's not really imprisoned in a certain moment, but that kind of flows. And I think for a first book, it's a very courageous one, because what she does is she and I find hard to do for most of the people who are, you know, young scholars, is to write and to think of the longue durée, right? I think most of the idea to move beyond that moment and to think of something that's longer is what I find breathtaking in the work, really, and not in its just ability to stretch theory and to think of, you know, how do we think of Gramsci and Fanon as traveling theory and to, you know, stretch them through the context, but also to stretch time, right? And to allow us to think of time in a less unidirectional manner and a more maybe circular and serpentine one. And so there is a move away from this fascination of the moment of 2011, which has preoccupied a lot of the writing, at least recently, right? And to think of that moment not as just an exceptional rupture, but something that flows really with the longer project of this afterlife of the nazarist project. And to think of this moment as reflecting a lot of these unresolved tensions, which in general tend to be talked about in the decade or so that preceded it, right? And there's a fascinated as if history had started at that moment. But what I find really interesting is, and I don't want to go into the specificities because I think that there are a lot, but really this, the persistence of nationalism, the ability of neoliberalism to weaken structures of hegemony, and the failures of certain class projects and why they fail. So I find it fascinating because she's kind of able to stay with the trouble, right? Yani the issue with the focus that came with the 2011 was that there was also, it stopped being interesting once it you know, ended, and there was people kind of moved away. But I feel this ability to stretch time and to place it within a longer durée helps her to stay with the trouble and ask the questions, not just in that moment, but also in kind of questions that persist really and keep appearing and reappearing as even the questions themselves as ghosts, right? Ghosts of the past that are there. So I'm thinking also the yani again the interest in the afterlife. And then afterlife of one project that reflects on an afterlife of another project is really fascinating to me. Specifically when she's thinking of these performative force of the past. And I'm thinking of when Sara was talking, when I was reading the book, and I was thinking of the persistence of the hegemonic project, even when it fails, right? Even when it's failing to continue to have the same effect, but the power of it in its afterlives. And I was thinking of actually when Morsi was in power, and then one of the things that he did on May Day was try and give May Day speech from the Iron and Steel Company, right? And there's there's constantly an attempt to try to invoke that project, which really talks about the importance of thinking of that project in its afterlife. But what I think, yani what she does again differently, and I'm very moved by it, is that she doesn't just think about it in terms of what are the ideas that persist, or the or invoking Gramsci to think of the kind of you know, forms of consent that continue or struggle to continue in that present, you know, in that afterlife, even, you know, even as someone like Morsi comes to power and tries to replay the role of, like, re-invoke the Nazarist project, even at, you know, when it's years away from it, right? But I think what's interesting here is that she's still continuing to invoke to us the critical political economy of that, right? And to think of what were the different class projects. In a way, I feel that sometimes there is two strands of thinking of the afterlife. There is the afterlife that comes with its ghosts and cultural ideas that persist. And there is the kind of a lot of writing that focus on the critical political economy that's so important, but that also does not tell us why someone like Morsi still needs to go and give a speech and, you know, get all the machines repainted so that he looks like freshly talking to the workers of Egypt, you know, in a moment that looks very, very different. So I really appreciate that ability to put both together, to talk about the class projects that fail and why they fail, but also to think of the ideas and the ideas that persist as well and continue to impinge on the moments that exist now. So I want to just maybe, I was thinking when I was thinking of that empty time, Sara, and just to wrap up and not go on for forever, but I was thinking of that empty time that you were talking about and how, you know, that increasingly it became about coercion as a way of rule. But I wonder, Kamen, if one can speak of the quality of the empty time, because, you know, even emptiness has a certain quality to it. And I kept wondering if it wasn't these jokes of attempt to invoke nazarist projects, which are continuing all the time, you know, whatever military regimes or religious ones. There's a joke kind of a nazarist ideas or dreams. But there is something else that they're doing. And I was thinking, for instance, of Mubarak's continuous invocation of istiqrar and stability, right? And it's a very different attempt to bring consent. It's a form of consent that really, it isn't just about, it's not the consent that comes from getting people together, but it's a consent that's very tied to the coercion, in the sense of consent كده بيلعب معك, it's kind of plays with coercion in the sense that telling people, well, our project is to keep what we have. Our project is stability. Our project is to keep producing. There's no big project. There's no big dream. Sometimes we play with it. Sometimes we invoking in different ways, but there is a project of the here and now, in a way, to go back to that. The project of the maintain whatever we can. And of course, that was very much able, he was very much able to do with invoking all the time the terror of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the terror of Irhab, and so on, which generated, one could say, a different form of consent. It's not the hegemonic consent you're talking about, and I totally agree with the premise that you're saying. But I think that maybe we can reflect a little bit more on the quality of that empty time, and what were the forms of, you know, coercion that aren't just brute force. Yeah. So yeah, I think I'm very moved by the book, and it helps me on a personal level, as someone who's trying to constantly ask what the hell was happening in the past years to us, right? To think about it in bigger terms, and I can see how the project is a big thing, because if one would write on one revolution is big, then writing about two of them and trying to link them together is definitely a big and courageous attempt, and I'm very grateful that you did it. I think it's quite fascinating.
All right. Thank you very much to Dina Makram-Ebeid for that important intervention. It's now time to welcome Adam Hanieh to the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, John, and thanks, Sara, for inviting me to participate today. It's also a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues who have spoken. And I want to begin by echoing the comments about the book. I really want to thank Sara for writing this book. It's clear that you know, a lot of work into this, and it really shows in the final product. I really do think this is a very powerful contribution to how both Nasser, that period, the colonial, anti-colonial struggle in Egypt, but also it speaks to, I think, debates around Marxism, postcolonialism that others have mentioned. I think are really, it's imperative we actually engage with these discussions today. So I think at both the level of understanding Egypt, but also these wider theoretical debates, it's a really, really powerful book. And I'm going to try and reflect on some of these questions that occurred to me as I was reading it over the last period. I also, one of the things I really book is that firstly, like all good writing, you really did work against kind of disciplinary constraints. It's truly an interdisciplinary book, which it's very difficult to do, but you did accomplish it, and you did allow, in this way, you did kind of permit a whole range of different kind of debates and literatures to actually speak together, I think, very effectively. I mean, for example, for people who you talk about Egypt's, cultural production, you talk about the political economy of finance capital, you talk about neoliberalism, you talk about ethnographic work, done on Egypt's labor and workers and peasants. And you combine all of this in a way that helps us understand, I think, and interpret that neoliberal, the period of Nasser's rule very effectively. So that, I think, is an immense task in itself, to be able to bring those things together so effectively. So what I wanted to do in my comments, I guess 3 or 4 questions that focus on my main concerns or my main research around class and state formation in the Middle East. And the first thing I wanted to talk or ask you to perhaps reflect further on is the way that Nasser and others at that particular point in time, other nationalist leaders at that particular point in time, employed the term socialism. And you have a very nice discussion around the Arab Socialist Union, the ASU, which was, and you make the point very effectively, this was a key vehicle of Nasser's consent making through the 60s up until, I think, 1976. It was disbanded, but the early period was very key to how Nasser did build this hegemonic project. And you talk in the ASU how there were different conceptions of socialism coexisting at that time. The idea of Islamic socialism, the idea of scientific socialism, Arab socialism. And but then you make a comment a few pages after talking about the kind of structure and the ideological content of the ASU, that it was, I think the phrase you used, it was explicitly socialist or a coherent socialism within that. And I'm wondering, to what degree, I mean, to my mind, thinking about the way Nasser used this phrase, Arab socialism, it reminded me of Frederick Jameson's idea of the vanishing mediator, in the sense that it's a term that it's very fuzzy, and it can mean many things to different people, and it certainly did at that time. And what function it plays, it resonates deeply with people, partly because it has this kind of fuzzy nature. But what it does, it actually legitimates a moment of transition into a completely different kind of future, which, the way that I read it, and I think you make this argument as well, is clearly a non-socialist future. So the term itself, the Arab socialist, this phrase of Arab socialism actually plays a role in transitioning to something quite different. So I'm wondering, if you could speak a little bit more about how the idea of socialism gets mobilized, and how you might think about socialism at this particular moment. Because there are other sides to this as well. I mean, you talk a little bit about the way that Nasser was able to, or did play this, did use this strategy of demobilization and attempt to prevent any kind of independent mass action outside of the structures of the state, whether it be through the ASU or whether it be through other corporatist kind of structures involved in trade unions or women's organizations, student organizations. And it seems to me that those things, those kind of structures were quite seamlessly taken over by Sadat and Mubarak in later times. One of the ways that the later, Sadat and Mubarak were able to kind of keep a lid on social struggle was through these kinds of these structures that they inherited and adapted from the Nazarist period. So, and you acknowledge this, and you acknowledge kind of the suffocating role that these organizations end up playing. So I guess the question is in relation, I mean, number one, this notion of socialism, but also to what degree can we see Nasser actually foreshadowing some of the political practices that we see in the later, and all the way through to Sisi today, I think. Not just ideologically, but in terms of political practice. The second thing I wanted to speak to is, and again, you raise a series of interesting questions. I think it's in the 4th chapter around the relationship between hegemony, finance, and our understanding of neoliberalism. And you make the point that there's been this expansion of financial markets over the last 30 to 40 years. This has really altered the way that human beings, households, individuals relate to society, the ways that they reproduce themselves, increasingly dependent upon the operation of financial markets. And I'm wondering to what degree does the kind of stable hegemonic project that you speak about in the Nazarist period, if we think about the concept of hegemony today in this financialized world that we live in, to what degree does a stable hegemonic project actually rest upon the supposed success of financial markets? In other words, that if hegemony is to be secure, and because so much of our lives are articulated through finance and financial markets, there is a necessity for there to be success in financial markets need to grow, they need to secure our futures and all the ways that we reproduce ourselves through them. And as we know, that's something very difficult for financial markets to guarantee because they're inherently, they're always going through moments of crisis. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that perhaps that story that you tell of Sadat and Mubarak is actually a bigger story. It's not just a story of Egypt. It's also a story of financial capitalism today. It's a global story that goes beyond that, and it's something to do with the kind of capitalism that we live in, and has been kind of pervasive across the globe in the last couple of decades. So, to what degree is that Sadat Mubarak period and the Sisi period and the Morsi period a universal story? Is what I'm pointing to here. Final thing I wanted to ask you about is again, to come back to this notion of hegemony and the questions of consent and coercion, and how we think about the relationship in particular between consent and coercion. Because you do it very nicely. You make the point quite strongly, and similarly to how John speaks about these ideas, that we shouldn't look at these terms as being counterposed or antithetical. That you say that coercion is necessarily embedded in consent, that they exist in a dialectical relationship. That they're not counterposed, they're not in juxtaposition to one another, which I fully agree with. But I do think it raises the question of how do we actually draw a line between these concepts, between consent and coercion? Where's the boundary that we draw between these two spheres, if they are necessarily existing in unity, internally related to one another? Because to me, it raises a practical political question, which is if consent is dependent upon coercion, always dependent upon some form of coercion, then how do we distinguish between a consent that we on the left would be happy to give and happy to support, and the more kind of authoritarian populist forms of consent that we might see existing across the globe that may have a basis of popular support, but rests upon this kind of coercive authoritarian structures that we wouldn't necessarily give our support to. So that's, I mean, again, it's a bigger question. It's partly, as Laleh said, my question, not so much a question. I mean, it's unfair to ask you of that, but it is, I think, something that it really did kind of continually reappear as I was reading through the text. So thanks again, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Adam Hanieh, for this important intervention. So I think we can judge at least that there's so many exciting and important themes and so many critical questions, and there's definitely a conversation happening here across disciplinary boundaries, and so that's a critical discussion that I'm certainly, it's like a pleasure to be part of it. So you have a number of questions and forms of appreciation before you, Sara. You're going to have about 10 minutes before we open it up more broadly, but you have sort of Laleh Khalili telling you that she's interested in the way your ambivalence around nationalism, but then questions, what are the limits of the nationalism in power? And then you have Adam Elliott-Cooper with this reflections on the situation of a third world national liberation project that's on the one hand sort of inward facing, but on the other side caught up in all sorts of pressures on the international stage. And then Dina Makram-Ebeid, who's appreciating your telling of a history, of thinking of it in events that are outside the academy, this way of escaping the prison house of the here and now, but then asking you about the quality of that empty time, that time after hegemony, where you have Mubarak, etc., with their istiqrar and their non-project. And then Adam Hanieh, who's saying, look, this is interesting, important interventions into debates about Marxism and postcolonialism, great variety of themes, but was this really socialism? What about the importance of financial capitalism in a certain sort of hegemony? And how do we, and then maybe the biggest question of all, where's the boundary between coercion and consent in terms of forms of hegemony and a struggle for hegemony that is progressive and emancipatory in some way? But so thank you, and you have a few minutes to grapple with just a couple of those questions.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you all for your engagements and amazing questions. I think so many of these are questions I have been thinking about for a long time and still have not resolved in any at all. But I think I will reflect on some of them because I think they get to the core of this question of the afterlives of anti-colonialism globally. I think many of these tensions are precisely what keep coming up today. And I think that they are really important to think about in relation to the left today and in relation to anti-colonialism today. So I'll start with Laleh's question about Nasser abroad versus Nasser at home, because I think it connects to Adam's question, Adam Elliott-Cooper's question as well, about this question of international hegemony that's being fought against through the cultivation of these national hegemonic projects. And I think in the case of Nasser, there is also a really important regional dynamic in the form of Arab nationalism, where, of course, Egyptian hegemony, even though I don't think I talk about this a lot in the book, was really quite dependent also on geopolitical shifts happening in the Middle East. And if we think about Egypt's war with Yemen, but also the way it unified with Syria, I think those were also really pivotal moments that were important to the construction of hegemony at home. So I definitely think that there was something about Nasser as a figure. I mean, he was a very global figure. I think also moments like the nationalization of the Suez Canal, it's this moment that for that generation is quite, I think, at least to me, seems quite symbolic of the shift that was happening globally. So I think there is something to that global stature that did a lot of work in cultivating this national hegemonic project. I think, though, that he was also I think that's where the ambivalence within Egypt comes from as well, because I think that stature abroad was also replicated within in many sectors. And I think it was those two things working together that created this particular strength. So I think that there was something about Nasser as a figure within Egypt as well, at that moment, that was really important to the story, but also the way that intersected with him as a figure abroad. And I'm always really struck by how, when we think about third worldism as a global project, he does seem to be one of these pivotal figures, which brings me to this question of affect, which is really fascinating. And I remember, I can't remember who it was by, but someone wrote this fascinating article actually about Nasser as a post-colonial masculine, I want to say heartthrob, because that's kind of how they defined him. But they did a really interesting analysis of Nasser at Bandung, the Bandung conference, where they kind of showed also how this happened, right? So how he interacted with crowds, and they kind of compared it to figures like Nehru, who would just get out of his car and go into the meeting and, you know, would just wave once at people. Whereas Nasser would kind of stop, and it was like a whole show of affect. And I think this is such a big part of this moment as well, especially if we think about television, radio as these kind of emerging forms of media that were really integral to these types of projects and to this moment. And I think there is something really important about the affect that was cultivated. And to me also, that's precisely why haunting is so fascinating, because I think haunting can capture that in ways that kind of political economic analysis of the legacies of Nasserism doesn't quite capture. It's precisely, I mean, I'm really interested in the images of him, for example, the black and white images of him often smiling or with crowds, or, you know, the images of Nasser's funeral that are quite evocative by themselves of the popularity, obviously, that he had at that moment, and how what that can tell us about the project more broadly. And I think with anti-colonialism, like you mentioned, David Scott's work on tragedy, I think those grand narratives of feeling are also really important. So whether it's tragedy, but also hope, optimism, promise, that are such a big part of that particular moment, that gave it a particular quality, I think. On the question of nationalism, I think that this is probably one of the most crucial questions that we have to grapple with in this moment. And Dina, you mentioned, you know, reading this in Egypt today. Obviously, Egypt today is also in a particular phase of its nationalist project. And to me, in the book, I think a little bit about anti-colonial nationalism as a particular strand of nationalism that maybe in some ways try to escape from what you call the chauvinism of nationalism when it's embedded within power. However, I think with Nasserism as a political project, because of its inception as a state-led project of decolonization, in distinction to, I think, other strands of anti-colonial struggle at that moment, whether it was feminists or workers, or, you know, there was just so much rich energy, I think, at that moment. And I think it's in those spaces and those writings and texts where we can see much more this idea of nationalism that, I don't want to say transcends that power, but tries to think of, is there a form of nationalism that we obviously in this moment people understood as necessary to the anti-colonial struggle, but obviously also saw the problems that were going to come about very quickly. To me, Nasserism, because of its inception as a state project, I think from the beginning was very much embroiled in that form of nationalism that you see as very tied to power. And of course, not least because of the military state form itself. Yeah, Adam, I think your point is so important about this global hegemony. At least in my sense, I think so much work on anti-colonial projects has tended to downplay that global struggle, right? And it's often this idea that we just need to know what was happening nationally, and the failure itself is often then located within the nation, or within the mistakes or the decisions, or how those projects said one thing and did another. And to me, it was really crucial to think of how there was the international sphere itself hadn't been decolonized, right? It was, and I think in the book, I use Vivian Jabri's term, the colonial international, but I mean, many people have written about this, about how there was an attempt by many of these nationalist movements to transform the global sphere as well, because of this awareness that capitalism in particular, global capitalism, was still structured in this form of dependency. And so there had to be some kind of intervention that would also, quote unquote, decolonize the international. And to me, again, that's why that's where the ambivalence with Nazirism comes from, because these moments like the nationalization of the Suez Canal was an intervention in that structure of the colonial international. It can't so easily be read, I think, as a form of dependent, a continuation of colonial capital in the present. So I think that that's such an important point. And I think it's such an important point today as well, right? Because in many ways that colonial international structure is very much present with us. And I think the focus on it kind of comes and goes, right? But it's important, I think, especially on the left, to think of how we can bring that back into the picture in a way that it's centered much more. Thank you, Dina, for your comments. I think your question about temporality is so fascinating, because I think it made me think a lot about this myth of stability, and how it's also become it was such a central thing post 2013 as well, right? This idea that we need stability, this revolution kind of just, there's chaos, everyone's, the economy is stopped, we need to get things back to this era of stability. And it really, like you said, functions as a way to depoliticize what were very political moments, and to kind of really narrow the imaginations and hopes that people obviously had in 2011 or in the 50s and 60s. So I think that that's really interesting. And I think this kind of relates to Hanieh's question about what is consent and what is coercion, because like you're saying, this form of consent in the idea that we need things to be stable, or, these calls to just stay away from politics, just let the state get things back to a position where everyone is okay, kind of traverse this line, right, between consent and coercion. It's a very coercive way of completely depoliticizing very powerful calls for change, but also is attempting to be this form of consent. And so I think that that's, coming to Adam's question, that's such a big thing to think about, because if we think of the world today as well, in the sense that right-wing movements in particular have been quite effective in some sense at this consent making, right? And at creating projects that in some areas have become quite hegemonic through these projects of consent. And so it's, to me, I don't think there's a moment where we can draw a clear line between the two. I think that because consent is also trying to measure individual reactions, responses, or views to things. I think these are shifting so often that it's quite difficult to pin that down. But also because even under Nazirism, there is this lingering question of, was this a coercive form of consent? Or is this a form of consent that we need to take seriously as a left-wing form of consent that was progressive? And how do we draw the line between the two? And I think that's something that I definitely still am grappling with and thinking about. And just to end, so I know I don't want to go over time, but your question about financial capitalism and hegemony is really fascinating, because to me, infitah, this transition to infitah in the late 60s or early 1970s, to me, what made hegemony very difficult or impossible in the 70s onwards, because infitah, at least at the beginning, was really built on these ideas of the future, the ideas of consumption, these ideas that there is something to look forward to. There are these possibilities now of social mobility. And it was, I think, to me, interestingly contrasted to kind of the ideas of especially kind of socialism as stagnant or not moving or not being able to kind of open up these wide vistas of the future. So I think there was this moment in the 70s of promise and of the idea that neoliberal restructuring can deliver all of this. But of course, that I think quite quickly was, like you're saying, it became clear that it couldn't, and that so much was invested in the idea of this possibility, with very little actually coming about. And I wonder, I think it's a really interesting question about, is that the story of finance capital? And are we in a moment today where we are seeing this crisis precisely because all of these promises from the 70s and 80s for vast majorities of people were never possible, but even for the people who kind of bought into the consent have clearly now also become impossible. I think I'll stop there.
All right, terrific. So I think you've also showed in your answers to the question some of the qualities of the book, which is a sort of approach where you insist on reflecting on, rather than trying to give us binary, definitive answers, you're reflecting on a set of problematics. And I think that really comes through in the book. But let's bring in the audience. I'm sure we'd all love to keep discussing here, but there's questions piling up. And the first one, I'll just take them in the order that they've appeared. And I think I'll pose them to you and see what happens. First one's from Kyle Anderson, and he says, well, Laleh speaks of the relation between nationalism and capitalism. What about nationalism and racism?
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. I think that that's a really crucial question in the frame of particularly the forms of anti-colonial nationalism and post-colonial nationalism in the 50s, as well as the forms of nationalism that we're seeing in Egypt today. So I think that that is a coming together that is really important to note and to think about. I think that what's important about the 50s in particular is how in this process of consent making and in this process of bringing together these many different groups, subaltern groups and so on under this banner of the nation, I think quite a lot of work was also done to define the nation in ways that were both expansive. So there was this attempt, like Adam was saying with socialism, to create an umbrella term that was able to capture as many people as possible. But I think even within that process, there were really clear limitations around the figure of the national subject that are important to highlight. And so, for example, Hanieh Shakri has done amazing work kind of highlighting the cultivation of the Egyptian national subject and national citizen over time, and how a lot of that was very much tied to gendered and kind of racialized ideas of Egyptianness and so on. And I think this is why I found particularly Julietta Singh's idea of mastery really important to think with towards the end of the book, in relation to how projects of decolonization, such as the building of the dam in Aswan, were still very much implicated, even as they were kind of seen as emancipatory projects that were widely popular to some extent, were still very much implicated in caste and racialized and gendered forms of violence. So in that particular case, of course, the forced migration of Nubians from their ancestral lands, but also the particular ways in which workers were mobilized to build this dam, and the ways that the forms of violence that emerged from that. So I think in many of these projects of decolonization, where nationalism did a lot of political work in terms of mobilizing the nation against colonial forces or against this international hegemony, there is an importance of being attentive to the ways in which that still did delineate very clear ideas that I think in the case of Egypt were highly gendered, classed, and racialized in terms of designating who is kind of the modern Egyptian subject, and how does the modernization of Egypt, or Egypt becoming independent and kind of becoming part of the new independent world order, depend on all citizens becoming like this, right? So this is kind of the civilizational aspect of this project that I think ties into this question.
All right, so thank you. Another question from Nermeen Abassi. What are the similarities and differences with other post-colonial, anti-colonial leaders, such as that of Bourguiba in Tunisia, which play on this concept of hegemony, but have different political, economic visions of their countries after colonial times?
Thank you, Nermeen. That's a good question. I think that, I mean, when I was thinking about Fanon's idea of the dependent bourgeoisie, which of course he wrote in relation to the African continent as a whole, it was interesting to think along with the way this materializes in some places and not in others. And I think that, for example, there are contexts in which quite clearly there's a ruling class that emerges after independence that does replicate this relationship of dependency, that doesn't try to break away from it and so on. And I think even in the context of the Middle East, there were cases in which post-independence, we don't see these radical socialist projects emerge at the state level. I think they were quite widespread in terms of movements. So, whereas in other places, and I'm thinking here especially of places like Burkina Faso or Congo, I mean, these were places in which the post-colonial state projects were quite radical in how they imagined the political economy of the future. Of course, with places like the Congo, this was stopped quite quickly through the assassination of Lumumba and so on. So to me, that's a really interesting question. I think that the argument I make in relation to nazarist hegemony is that this hegemony was very much predicated on the decision to adopt a form of third worldism and independent development that allowed this hegemony to become possible. I don't know that. I think in other places, what we often see is when the path of dependency is chosen, I don't know that that led to these strong hegemonic projects, but I think that there's so many different cases, it's really hard to make a generalized rule. And I think that's why in this book, it was important to trace it in the single context or single case, because I think the politics of hegemony itself are so connected to the shifts that were happening both nationally and internationally at that particular moment.
All right, thank you. So another question from Esra Youssef. Two questions, actually. First, I was wondering if you could speak about how your process of examining past post-colonial projects in Egypt made you think of possible anti-colonial socialist Marxist projects in the future in Egypt. Secondly, I'm not sure if you agree or not, but from the discussion, I understood that what you call the empty period, quote unquote, is the era post-Nasserism. Do you think the period we're in right now, since 2013 until now, could be described similarly?
Thank you, Isra. So for the first question, from what I'm understanding is whether this examination of past post-colonial projects in Egypt can make us think of future anti-colonial socialist projects. I think that's a great question. I think that it's quite, I think in the moment that we're living in now in Egypt, at least in my sense, it is this moment of counter-revolution, but also this moment of thinking about the revolution itself. And like Dina was saying, whether this was a failure, was it, you know, and all these questions around whether it was a revolution and so on. So I don't know that what the future prospects are or what the future holds. I think it's quite a difficult and big topic. I do think that like the ideas of socialist projects in the past crop up quite often and did crop up a lot in 2011. And I think to me, that's where this idea of haunting, or this idea of how the past seeps into the present, even if not in the form of a socialist movement or a strong left, but there are these ideas that I think were very much central to socialist politics in the 50s and 60s that still hold some kind of power in the present. And I think, like Dina mentioned, to the extent that we know Morsi, but also Sisi has made use of these invocations quite often, right? Because they do have this power. So I think I would think about it more I would try and trace more whether those ideas and those notions of what social justice mean, what a just society means, how to counter austerity and so on, how those are coming up in the present and what that might mean for the future. But I think it's quite difficult in this moment, especially with how much the international sphere and the regional political sphere is shifting to really be able to predict that. But obviously, I hope that's the future, but I don't know.
And are we in an empty period, empty time since 2013?
I think that there are dimensions of that in the present. I think there have been attempts by the state in particular to mobilize this idea of stability and this idea of kind of almost, okay, we've had this eruption in 2011, but now we need to kind of go back to normal. We need to go back to this stable period. But I don't think, to me at least, I wouldn't say it has the same quality as empty time, because I think 2011 challenged too much for that to have just settled this quickly. I think that there is actually still quite a lot of contestation around what stability means and what the promises of stability are, maybe in comparison to when it came up more in the 90s and 2000s.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Dalia El-Qadi. May I ask you to elaborate a little bit on the financial class and the financialization of politics in the aftermath of 1991? I find this very exciting and just wanted to know more from you.
Of course, thank you, Dalia. So the argument I make in the book is that although infitah, so the move towards neoliberalism, happens in the early 1970s or late 1960s, I think that the ruling class that emerges at that moment is still quite conscious of the ideas of nazarism and this focus on consent. And I think that even when we look at IMF structural adjustment, which began in Egypt quite early, it was one of the first countries in the post-colonial world to implement some of these projects. The pace of it actually was quite slow in comparison to what the IMF wanted at that moment throughout the 70s and 80s. To me, it's interesting, in the mid-1990s, we do see the emergence of the new kind of class or a new group of politicians in Egypt. One of them, of course, is Hosni Mubarak's son, Gamal Mubarak. And to me, this new kind of circle of businessmen, I think of as this financial class. And I think it's at this moment that we start to see quite rapid changes in privatization. So when you look at the number of firms or public projects that are privatized, this increases really rapidly in the 2000s and 2010s. When we think about the project of finance capital, and especially in relation to Gulf investment, this increases dramatically as well at this point. So to me, it was interesting to ask, although we don't actually have a shift in presidents, so Hosni Mubarak is kind of in power for 30 years for this whole period, but there is this shift at the level of political economy. And to me, that's why it was quite interesting to think of, is there a new financial class that's emerged or a new ruling class that's emerged in the mid-1990s?
Okay, thank you. So, question from Abdullah Shahid. During these times of the rise of populism and nationalism around the world, wondering what we can learn from the Egyptian case about the interaction between nationalism, globalism, and democracy as ideas, programs, and projects.
Thank you. That's a really big question. What can we learn from the Egyptian case? I think that my main thing that I would point out here is actually, again, to come back to the ambivalence and the power contestations that happen around these categories, like nationalism, but also democracy and globalism. I think it was, to me, the richness of looking at a single case like Egypt while still situating it globally was precisely that it does allow you to see just how contested these ideas are. So coming back to Adam's point about socialism, although I think the ruling class deploys socialism in a way that tries to stretch it as broadly as possible, it did have such a wide variety of meanings. People mobilized it in different ways, and it did a lot of political work across different segments of the population. And I think that focus on a case, whether it's Egypt or another case, allows us to kind of see that detail that I think is really important in this moment, and thinking through how even this idea of democracy has such a wide variety of meanings and histories across the globe that are really important in thinking through how it's being invoked or mobilized today. But I don't know if other people want to jump in on that very big question, but.
Well, I've just, we might come back to the panel, but the next question's from Denzel Chetty. By applying Gramsci's as a theory as a lens, do you see the rise of a progressive subaltern linked to an organic intellectual class being spawned, or the potential of such spawning in the current political imaginary?
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, I think that this is something that, I mean, I think what I really appreciated about the lens of hegemony is precisely that it does focus on the ruling class, but also does make quite a lot of space for subaltern politics and subaltern classes. And I think that tracing both organic and traditional intellectuals across different projects is a really fruitful way of also understanding kind of the different forms of contestation happening or resistance happening at any moment. So I think I would say that each era or each moment does have what we might call organic intellectuals. I think what we might see different across different stretches of time is the ability of organic intellectuals to really bring together a hegemonic movement from the left, or strong enough levels of consent from the left or from progressive subaltern forces to challenge hegemony. So like I was saying earlier, I think we do in some places see this happening on the right. I think there are, and of course, organic intellectuals and traditional intellectuals, just like hegemony, don't have to be in and of themselves progressive. So I think it's quite interesting in our current moment to see how this is happening both on the left and on the right. But to me, I think that is quite constant across time. I think resistance is always there, but it's about maybe thinking of how this gets turned into a hegemonic project that can challenge regressive hegemonies.
Right, thank you. So another question from Hashim Abu Shama. How does the book Colonial Afterlives, Anticolonial Afterlives, I think, set in relation to Arab Marxist thought? For example, Mehdi Amil also speaks of the creation of nationalist elites whose existence depends on the colonial structures.
Thank you, Hashim. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the book doesn't focus as much on Marxist thought as much as it could have, or as much as other recent books that have come out have. And I think partly there is a part of the book that tries to think with how Marxist concepts have been developed in the Arab world, or in North Africa in particular, in relation to debates around whether there are concepts in Marx's work that are applicable to the global South and how we would go about using them. So I think in that sense, there is an engagement with Arab Marxist thought, which interestingly has engaged quite broadly with Gramsci, although less so with Fanon. I think the book is more of the focus goes to thinking about how political projects made use of Marxist concepts or Marxist Marxist kind of organization. So for example, again, with the Arab Socialist Union, I did find it really important to think about, on the one hand, how it deployed socialism, and how that kind of spoke to trends of socialist thought in the region. But I was also really interested in what the Socialist Union was doing politically. So what was the political work being done by these types of organizations? So I think in that sense, I would say the book is more focused on how these differing or contradictory ideas of Marxism and socialism were deployed by these political state projects, rather than necessarily how they emerge through intellectual history.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Rasha Meher Al-Badri. Why did you use afterlives in the title? What is the intended meaning?
Thank you, Rasha. So I think the word afterlives for me was partly an attempt to connect these three political projects into one trajectory. I think that there was the key part of the book is arguing that there is this hegemonic project in the 50s and 60s, but also that this project was very central to the formation of the projects that come afterwards. So it's not necessarily that these are three distinct projects or that they kind of build on each other but are quite separate. I kind of use the term to think about the temporality of these projects in relation to one another, but also to kind of signal this idea that the two projects that come afterwards are this afterlife of hegemony, and they very much are built within and confined to, in some sense, within the parameters that are set by this anti-colonial moment and the post-colonial project. So that's kind of where I was coming from with that term.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've at the moment we're in a situation where we've run through a string of questions, and thanks to your concision in answering them, we're at a stage where we could invite you to make some further comments, or because there's time, wouldn't the panel? I mean, there's so many critical points that have come up, and there's you know, I think you could push Dr. Salem on some of these issues, because there's a lot of interesting reflexive work, but some of you have asked some quite pointed questions, and you know, I think you could pursue those avenues. But if I would, would anybody like to come in to carry on with the discussion? Okay, Laleh.
I'm going to jump in here with a question that I hinted at in the discussion, and I really want to hear a little bit more about, perhaps because it is a question that I constantly think about. So when I asked what is the role that Nasser played, how his external role kind of reflected on his role as a kind of a hegemonic force within Egypt, one of the things that I had silently in the back of my mind was the question of Palestine. But also, in addition to the question of Palestine, the role that Nasser played in Yemen, which you also brought up very briefly in your discussion. And what I'm curious about is, why is it that on the one hand, the kind of the performative element of or the performance, not performative, but the performance element of Nasser on the global stage became such a huge factor, and it was such a sort of an important way in which he was reflected back at home. But on the other hand, in the case of Palestine, he actually betrayed Palestinians in many ways. What happened with all of the Ghazawi Fedayeen who were arrested and put in prison in Egypt, etc. But also in the case of Yemen, he used extraordinary violence against Yemenis, even deploying chemical weapons. And so I'm wondering about, why is it that the story of the Nasser, the romance of Nasser, sort of doesn't bear these elements, at least contemporaneous to him, within Egypt itself? Why is it that these kinds of problems don't touch on his aura? Which also asks, actually, it is a kind of a reflection a little bit of Adam's final question, which is that why does his deployment of violence against other Arabs doesn't dent his image as a pan-Arab hero? I'm just really curious about this, and I've always been, and I'm trying to understand it. So thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, yeah. I think that's a really fascinating question, because I wonder if that is precisely the power of hegemony, though, is that it is able to contain these massive contradictions and these massive forms of violence within it, and still put forward a particular narrative of what this hegemonic project is. And that's why, to me, you know, something like Voice of the Arabs is so actually fundamental, because Voice of the Arabs was essentially Nasser's station, right? And it was a tool of foreign policy and geopolitics that was very clearly deployed in part, especially in kind of these regional adventures, or these forms of regional hegemony making, I would say. So to me, I think that is precisely the power of this project is that these contradictions were clear at that time. And I think that it's not that these are contradictions that became clear after, although I would say that, I don't know if Dina agrees, but I think Nasser's image in Egypt today is very different and actually highly contested. I think people have very strong reactions, but those reactions really can be across the spectrum and not necessarily have this idea of the hero or the Pan-Arab hero, I think, is not one that has as much purchase in the present. So it's not, but I don't think it's that these contradictions just became clear in the present. I think that they were very much living contradictions at that moment. And it's precisely that these things were happening, so the war in Yemen, but also the union with Syria and the problems that emerged from that. The ways in which also the Palestinian struggle was invoked quite a lot at the start of this project, and it was really seen as such a foundational pillar up, which is why, of course, 67 was such a powerful moment. But these contradictions did live alongside one another. I do think, though, that this was a result, a lot of it was the result of the work that this project put into itself. And I think that's why I think partly the consent that existed at this moment was a result of this was an anti-colonial moment. This was a global trend. There was Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, and all of these movements. But I do think there was a way in which Nasser understood the importance of consent. And I think that a lot of work was put not only into kind of these newspapers and channels, but also the educational system. Like you were saying, also the performance of foreign policy abroad and so on. So to me, I think, and I don't know if this is a convincing argument, but I think this is what hegemony is in some sense. It's that containing within a project these contradictions that people knew of and were very aware of, but still being able to perpetuate a particular view. And I think that's why it's important with Nasserism. I think although movements like Pan-Arabism and Pan-Africanism were really crucial at that moment, there was an element of regional hegemony that came out of the Nasserist project, or this moment of national hegemony. And I think with regional hegemony, there are these moments of that people have talked about, of giving aid to rebel movements in other places, but also of precisely these moments of violence. I think it is interesting. A lot of really good work has come out lately as well, especially from the Gulf, about the role, of course, of Nasserism in leftist movements around the region. And I think it's precisely that it was this force of inspiration in many senses, while also as a project containing these moments of violence. I don't know, Dina, if you wanted to add, or if anyone wanted to add to that. It's a really great question.
Well, at the moment, we don't have any questions from the audience, but I'd like to invite Adam Hanieh to say something, and of course, Dina and Adam Elliott-Cooper, if you want to come in after that, that's terrific.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I guess following off Laleh's question and further on this, the kind of understanding the consent and coercion in the Egyptian context, because it seems to me it's very striking in your book, all of the communists that you quote are speaking from prison, or speaking from a position of anguish, caught between I think you use a phrase, kind of the logic of anti-imperialist populism versus the kind of class struggle program. So it seems to me one of the other factors that explains Nasser's ability to establish this project is actually the failure of an alternative project from the Egyptian left, and particularly from the communist movement in Egypt, which is, as you point out, was quite strong. It had, it had a base, it had a social weight to some degree. So, and I'm wondering again if this is part of the story of the international story that you're talking about, in particularly to what degree did the the debates in the international communist movement around things like class and nation and the relationship between national struggle, or the prioritization of the national struggle, subordination of the class struggle at this particular point. To what degree did these kinds of debates really kind of shape that failure of the Egyptian communist left to make a difference, or to chart a different kind of course vis-a-vis Nasser at that time?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that, and it's really interesting that a lot of the memoirs that have been written by leftists, especially in the 60s and 70s, there is also a very affective dimension to the way in which they think back to that moment, and kind of some of them, it's really this idea of what happened, like what just happened. And I think they speak really powerfully also about this idea of the entanglement of leftism and nationalism that happened at this moment. But I think a lot of them also talk about strategy, and that for some of them, there was this idea that Nasserism as a project was the only possible way in which independence could be brought about, and that especially in the early days, there was this moment of almost hope on the part of some leftist forces that, okay, this project is kind of talking our language. This, as a movement, can we counter this project? Is that, are we in the same? Are we able to create this alternative, like you said? And I think that, again, many of them very quickly realized that this was not kind of this leftist utopian project and so on. But still, you see this very difficult grappling with, well, what do we think? What do we do with this project? What do we do at this moment? How do we understand also precisely the imprisonment of the left and so on? And I think this again comes back to the ways in which the global international historical moment that was made it very difficult to think outside of, I think, some of these post-colonial state forms that came about, because many of them made use of a lot of this rhetoric. They put in place limited material shifts that seemed to speak to this leftist imaginary, but also became quite powerful very quickly, ironically, because they were mobilizing a lot of these ideas. And I think in the case of Egypt, by the late 50s or early 60s, I think Arwa Saleh has this quote where she's like, this was the only game in town. The choice for a leftist was either to be like resisted and be put in jail, or embrace it. So I think that there was, like you're saying, that defeat of the other alternatives, or not defeat, but the making impossible of other alternatives at that moment was a big part of this story as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps one or two more questions from the panel. You said you might pose a question, Adam Elliott-Cooper, yes. And one from Dina, and then we'll turn it to Sarah, and that's probably how we'll wrap up.
Great. So Sara, I'm particularly interested in a question that you pose in the book. I don't know which page it is, but you say that you're especially interested in Fanon's understanding of what a real bourgeoisie ought to do, and the parallels of Gramsci's understanding of hegemony. I don't know if you've developed or thought through because it seems like almost a contradictory question, right? What does a Marxist want the bourgeoisie to do? Well, we kind of know what they want them to do, right? They do one, but I feel like on the one hand, there's the kind of the obvious answer of like devolve your power downwards, but thinking about Adom Getachew and other people who are thinking about this kind of post-colonial moment, it's also about kind of devolving their power upwards into these kind of attempts at a supranational federal kind of attempts at devolving economic and political power to these kind of regional blocks. But I guess that also poses the question as to whether a bourgeoisie would ever do that. Given the nationalism and the problems of nationalism, the problems that nationalism arises, that nationalism is this project which is often within particular confines, and there's a particular image of what the nation is, and therefore people don't advocates of those projects don't want to devolve power to people outside of those confined national projects, but also because of, I guess, the personalities and the chauvinism that comes with these kinds of national projects, and the way in which what often starts as national liberation projects can turn into purely nationalist projects, and the obvious problematics that come with that. So I'm interested in this question that you pose, and the extent to which you might be able to elaborate on it, perhaps.
All right, and perhaps if Dina, if you wanted to come in, and then we'll hand it to Sara.
Yeah, I wanted to keep asking you, Sara, about this like coercion, consent kind of thing. And it's always like, it seems like consent is the thing that needs more, attempt to explain, and coercion is kind of somehow straightforward. But I want to try and ask in like, how can we think of coercion as actually not that straightforward? And I think you do allude to that also specifically towards the end on like, when you, in the conclusion, when you think of disappearances and, forms of coercions that aren't necessarily just that direct force in itself, even if of course disappearance is a direct force, but what it does is much more rippled. And I was thinking of like, going back to the question that Hanieh was thinking about of like, financial capital and what forms of coercion actually, are pushed on people or that aren't just the typical things we know, it's not just about that failure of hegemony because people are put in prison, which of course, is obvious, but also, as I was thinking in this idea of like pushing forth ideas on stability, or just being extremely focused on the individual, right? As a form of that, this is your entire life. It's all about you. It's all about your, your house, it's very atomic in a way. And I wanted to just think of like, what are the forms of coercions that also persisted, right? And that made consent almost impossible, because it's not just about the fear of putting people in prison, which of course is there, but there is much more other subtle forms of coercion that might be worth reflecting on if one were to think of the future also of
let me hand that to Sara, so we don't run out of time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for those really great questions. I think, Adam, it's really interesting because Fanon talks about this. He really spends quite a lot of time kind of mocking this dependent bourgeoisie that emerges in the post-colonial world. And he's like, even although it claims to be a bourgeoisie, it's not doing what the bourgeoisies in Europe did, right? Which is accumulate capital in particular ways and actually put in place a capitalist system through which they can kind of accumulate all this wealth. Instead, of course, what it's doing is acting like a conduit between the real bourgeoisies in Europe and resource extraction or forced labor in the post-colony. And I think it's a really interesting question, because I think it's precisely around these questions of nationalism and these personalities and kind of the closing off of power rather than devolving it upwards or downwards that you see that even the most radical post-colonial state projects still embodied elements of Fanon's dependent bourgeoisie and still embodied these ideas of not kind of ceding power to the people. So I think that's why his concept, and that's why to me Nasserism contradicts it, but also reproduces it in completely different ways, because we do see that reproduction of power being kept in a very particular sphere. And of course, Fanon goes on to say that to decolonize, you need to cede power back to the people. That is what decolonization ultimately means. It's a form of socialism that, of course, we know many of these projects, like you're saying, quickly kind of went the opposite way. So I think it's a really interesting question, but also thinking about the dependent bourgeoisies we still have in many of these countries, right? And in many ways have become even more dependent. And yeah, I think, Dina, your point is so important. And I like, for example, Avery Gordon, when she writes about disappearance, she's like, the act of disappearance is not just to disappear the one person, but it's about the effect that this has on society more broadly. It's about that fear, about not knowing why someone was disappeared, whether it could happen to you. That also is something that is a big part of the kind of coercive nature of disappearance. But I think you're right. I think the coercion that we see in the 70s onwards is often about these subtle erasures of other ways of being, other ways of thinking. And I'm thinking in particular about even the fear of articulating certain ideas or articulating certain things, the kind of increasing, which we see now coming about even more, idea of thinking through the lens of the individual, thinking of what is happening to you is not structural, it's your own making, these types of ideas. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about coercion as well. That, of course, is something we see everywhere in really scary ways. And I think is very connected to Adam's point about the nature of financial capitalism. All
right then. So it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to chair this, and thank you very much to all the panelists for that engaged and important commentary. To Dr. Sara Salem and your book, Anticolonial Afterlives in Egypt, The Politics of Hegemony, which is now out with Cambridge University Press 2020. And thank you very much to the audience and those of the participation on the live feed and the questions. And we hope you'll go out and read the book and engage further, and this conversation and how it relates to the world will carry on. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing how this book, the afterlife and ongoing hegemonic struggles around the book, unfold in the future.
Thank you, John, and thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement. It was such a pleasure and such an honor to share this with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.